Well, hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Conversations. And today I have my friend, Dr. Ryan Van Manen. He has been instrumental in allowing us to run the Ezra Free Clinic, which is temporarily on hold. Is that correct?
Yep.
Just
for the time
trying to be wise with that. But I think that's been going for 8 years now.
Almost 9 or 10, 9 years, I think.
9 years.
A little over 9.
And that was really a conversation you had with me of just saying, what would it look like to start a free clinic? And in light of our current reality with the pandemic and things, I was just really hoping to bring you on and ask you some questions because you have more medical knowledge than I do. And it's interesting. I don't know if you remember this, is about 2 weeks ago, you were in my driveway and I was like, hey, I got some pastor friends who are starting to flip out a little bit, like they can't have service and stuff. I'm like, is that crazy? And you're like, well, I think you might want to take this seriously. And 6 hours later, we were scrambling because we chose not to have services. So all of that was a part of this thing called social distancing. So I want to start with that. Is it working is kind of one of the main kind of things. And I'm just curious, like, I get this whole flattening the curve. Why is that the goal here? Like, what is that doing?
Sure. So, I mean, the whole idea of flattening the curve would be, just that we have a finite amount of resources in our health system. Everybody talks about, based on the predictions of, they say that anywhere from 40 to 70% of people might contract this virus in the United States. Well, we know that, based off of numbers from other countries, that maybe 80% of people are just going to have a mild, 4 out of 5 people, it's just a cold. Some people don't even know that they have the virus. So, but there are going to be a substantial amount of people that are going to need medical care, maybe up to 20%, 19 to 20% based off of numbers that we're getting already. And so the whole idea of flattening the curve is that we only have a certain amount of ventilators, for patients that need ventilators. We only have a certain amount of oxygen for patients that need oxygen. At some point in time, it might come down to we only have X amount of healthy staff members at hospitals to take care of the patients, because those patients are going to take a lot of resources if they get very ill. So the idea of flattening the curve is not necessarily that we don't anticipate 40 to 70% of the population to get it. But if we can slow that down and have it over the course of, instead of, a 2 to 3 week time period where hospitals get overwhelmed and they don't have enough resources, that we can kind of spread that out over the next few months and maybe be able to take care of people. It's interesting as you look at some of these countries and how some countries have taken that standpoint and some have not. You look at mortality rates between those two countries and they're very different.
Yeah, there's a huge contrast I see often between Italy and South Korea.
Yeah.
And, ventilators, you brought that up. What hospital do you currently work at?
Decatur County Hospital.
Okay, but you've spent time both in Mount Pleasant and in Ottumwa serving. Mm-hmm. And, in those hospitals, like what's the checklist right now of what they're, because I'm guessing they're not seeing, if there's only been one case in our county, I'm guessing there's not a lot of rush, but maybe there is. So basically, what are the hospitals currently doing? And then, like, are people coming and getting tested a lot? How's that kind of play out?
Yeah. So as far as the first question, as far as, thinking about the different, like how many ventilators, like for instance, our hospital, we have 2 ventilators in the hospital, but we also have, so that's for, our emergency department, our hospitalized patients and transporting patients. But we also have an OR, an operating room where they do surgeries. So the operating room has ventilators that they use for their surgical patients. So a lot of hospitals right now are shutting down their operating room in case they were to need those ventilators too. So total, we have 4 ventilators at our hospital. There's talk about, using those ventilators differently to maybe be able to ventilate more patients. And so that's something that's interesting and that's never been tested. But, as we think about
trying something new right now,
as we think about, if the need arises that we might have to do something differently, there's other forms of ventilation too that people can use, like, CPAP machines and BiPAP machines, non-invasive ventilators, and even just ambu bags with special equipment attached to it that people can use that's not always recommended at this point, because they're thinking that because the virus could be aerosolized or carried in the air, that some of the equipment actually may be dangerous right now, but at some point in time, if we run out of the other safer options, we might have to use that.
You said, just even now, like we got access to maybe do 2 patients with 1 ventilator, but you said it takes a lot of staff to run that. So it's not just a ventilator shortage that is driving, let's slow this down. There's other resources besides ventilators.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, they're talking about that you could ventilate up to 4 people on 1 ventilator. And I'm just thinking, well, that's great, but I only have 2 nurses in the entire hospital. So even if I have 4 ventilators, if you look at a typical ICU, a lot of the staffing is 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 at the most for 1 nurse to a patient, because they require a lot of close attention, close monitoring. And so, yeah, I think at some point in time, it may not be a ventilator shortage that we're worried about. It might be more of a staff.
Yeah. You were sharing that you were getting do you as a doctor have like a video chat with other CDC? Like, how do you get your information on things? I'm guessing you do different than I read Google and others.
I was just going to say Google is basically
WebMD.
I mean, for me personally, I have certain medical education that I subscribe to. Some of it's free online stuff, and some of it is stuff that I pay to stay up to date on different medical topics. And so it's just fascinating how, usually I get 1 per month update from this place, and it's like every day it's coming out with something new. Like, hey, here are these new studies that came out. Here's what people are going to be talking about. Here's what here's where we go from here. Here's how you can be prepared. The biggest, I would say, resource at this point for a lot of hospitals has been the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. They put out lots of great videos and, how do you safely take care of patients, putting on and not taking off your gear. And
tell me a little bit about that, because
oh man.
You said, oh man, because it's a process, you were telling me. Like, so this is, if you wanted to test someone or you wanted to be working with someone, you have to like gear up, right? So what is that process?
Well, if you look at the CDC's, video that they've got online, it's very, very much not how it's recommended currently for this outbreak that we've got. But the video actually shows them putting on all this gear: face shields, masks, eye protection, goggles, gowns, outer aprons, 2 sets of gloves. And I mean, that's all great if you have that equipment, but a lot of hospitals don't have all that equipment. We don't have the resources to go through that for every patient. And so I think what the CDC right now is recommending is to, for droplet precautions, which means, your face is covered, preferably your eyes are covered, any of your mucous membranes, as well as gloves and a gown. And that kind of gets into semantics of what is a droplet and what is an aerosolized particle. And so, there are certain times where, certain procedures that can be done, certain, even nebulizing medications that can maybe aerosolize the virus. And so, again, a lot of this stuff
I've been on a nebulizer before, so I get what you're saying.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff we just don't know. I mean, every day is new. I mean, because when we were talking before, it was like, well, this is crazy, to talk about possibly canceling church, but it's a reality.
Yeah.
And it came so quickly. Like, I was even thinking as we were talking about it, like, I can't imagine. But then, schools are closed, and then churches are closed, and I mean, it just keeps going on. So I think
church isn't closed. We just moved to online.
Yeah, exactly. But every day is new. So, I mean, by the time this comes out, we're going to be behind the 8 ball, because there's so many things coming out, so many new studies coming out. And so it's rapidly changing.
Is there anything that you have seen that have kind of pointed to possible vaccines or solutions or things like, do you get notified of some of that?
Well, I try to stay abreast of what's going on from that standpoint. And with the medical education that's coming out, a lot of times they'll reference these different treatments or vaccines. Now, there is a vaccine being tested right now. I mean, so the encouraging thing is that it was really quick in coming out with a vaccine for this virus. Now, the discouraging thing is that, it has to go through the certain processes unless something changes and the president says and the FDA says we don't need safety testing, which is not always a good idea, because a lot of vaccines do have complications. You know, people can get sick, people can get neurologic issues, Guillain-Barré, and things like that from some of these other vaccines. So you obviously want to know if the vaccine's not only effective, but if it's safe. And so they say typically it takes about a year and a half for a vaccine to go through all of those processes. And maybe since things are looking quickly, right, you know, going so speedily right now, maybe we'll get something sooner. But
Okay.
I can't imagine that we're going to have a vaccine anytime in the near future.
Okay.
As far as other treatments, there's lots of treatments out there too. There's treatments that have been designed for some of these other similar viruses, like so that, you know, everybody is calling it COVID-19, which is technically the disease, but the actual virus is a coronavirus, but it's the, you know, SARS coronavirus 2. So kind of looking back at some of these other similar viruses like SARS and MERS, there were antivirals that were developed for some of these, you know, or that was the thought, is that we want to have something ready. And so there's like an antiviral right now that's going through trials too, to see if it's effective. There's some other antibiotics that we use normally, and there's like a rheumatoid arthritis drug, like an anti-malarial drug that's showed some promise as well. There's HIV medication that they're testing as well right now that might have some promise for treating the disease. So there are things coming. We just won't know for a while.
You know, for me, I think my first response is often just like, are we blowing this out of proportion? And then I have another kind of like, oh my goodness, this is a big deal. And I kind of waffle back and forth until now I'm just like, hey, how do we appropriately like play our part in being a part of slowing everything down? What would you say to the people who are just like, we're blowing this out of proportion? This isn't like, because the numbers are still not, you know, I've heard 1 million deaths are possible in the United States, right? So like, what would you say to those who are just like, this is getting blown out of proportion, you know?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because, you know, I struggle with that myself. You know, I don't want to be locked away, but at the same time, you know, there's people that are smarter than me that are coming up with these recommendations. There are people that are having experiences with this. This isn't coming out of nowhere. This is, you know, coming from people that have had experience from the outbreak in China and in Italy and seeing what's going on there. And so I think just extrapolating what happens when people don't take those things they don't respect the recommendations, is that, you know, it goes much quicker and people are without resources. And I mean, I think the other thing that goes with this, as I was thinking about it, is like, it's not like hospitals are sitting twiddling their thumbs saying, I can't, you know, they're just waiting for this coronavirus thing to explode. Hospitals are already full before this started. I mean, you know, it's not uncommon for me to have a patient that I want to transfer to another hospital and they say, we don't have any beds. So it's not like we were waiting for the coronavirus to fill up the hospital. Like the hospitals are already full.
Actively.
There's still pneumonia, there's still influenza, there's still heart failure and COPD patients that need ventilators. So even beyond this, I mean, it's not like you hear these numbers of how many ventilators are there in the United States and we're expecting this many million people to get it. It's not that these ventilators are all sitting unoccupied until they need it for coronavirus. They're being used right now anyway. So, I mean, you know, hopefully the production of more ventilators will come out. We'll find some other machines and techniques to ventilate people and help them as well. But so I think that's one thing as far as, you know, should we respect, you know, what these, you know, government agencies are recommending us to do? I mean, I think another thing just as Christians is we're, you know, encouraged to respect authority in the Bible. So should we just do it because we're supposed to do it as Christians? I mean, I think is another way that we can look at it as well. But
no, I think that's good. I think you know, for me, it's one of those. I'm wanting to be wise, but I'm also wanting to be of help. And so sometimes it's like being of help puts you in position to be with people, but sometimes being with people isn't the most helpful thing. And so I think that's one of the things that I have a little bit of tension with for my vocation and trying to choose into that. You obviously, you're really hands-on with it. You know, one of the things that I've been interested in, what impacts us the most is like it went from like 250 gatherings down to 100 gatherings, to 50 gatherings to 10 or less, you know, to it just keeps moving in different things. Is there a difference in your research or awareness between like a gathering of 10 to 250? Like, is that significant?
What is the safe threshold? I don't think we know, and I don't think that there is any particular safe threshold, because the problem is that a lot of young, healthy people, they don't get severe symptoms. They may not have symptoms at all, or they may, have symptoms later, but they don't yet, and yet they're still spreading the virus even before they become acutely ill. So that's the difficulty with it. I've even just as I'm hearing these different medical things come out through the literature, even describing that some of the symptoms are really odd, like you might lose smell for normal things or lose taste even before you get some of these other, that they might start screening for that,
Interesting.
And so yeah, I don't think that there's any necessarily safe level that it's like there's something magic about 10 people that it can't be spread, because again, somebody may have it, not know it, and spread it. And I think that's the difficulty too, is we're thinking about our patients and our people in our community who are more at risk for it. That those of us who are healthier or younger and may not have the symptoms, we still possibly will spread it to them.
Yeah. Do you think, obviously, the concentration of big cities versus the population of maybe, say, like Iowa, where it's a little bit more rural and spread out, do you think that will allow for a rebound quicker, or does that make sense? Like, do you think it'll hit us later? And
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that we know that. I think, given a couple more weeks, I think we'll have a lot more data as far as what to expect and spread and things like that. Obviously, being more remote and rural, you would think that, and it seems like it's happening that way. You look at New York and you look at California and how they're being hit harder. It would seem that we would maybe be hit later. Maybe that's a benefit for us, that we get to kind of learn from some of these other places.
We could leverage other insight.
Experiencing it. So I think being rural, I think, we are more isolated. We are going to get it hopefully later, but we travel so much it's just interesting how many people travel, or they're in contact, or they have to go this place for business, that I don't think anybody's necessarily, immune to it or isolated from it, with how mobile we are as a society now. So.
Yeah. I don't know if you've gotten in touch. Ryan and I, we have a mutual friend. His name is Garth, and he lives in Cambodia. And I was talking to him just a couple days ago. And, for him, being in a population of about 350,000 people in a place called Battambang, and it's really tough to bring restrictions in that area. And so he just kind of expressed, like, I'm a little bit concerned. What does it look like should it pop up here?
Yeah.
And are you seeing anything in what are sometimes referred to as third world or developing countries? Is there?
I think the difficulty there is that, I was talking with somebody about this just recently, is like, do they have the resources to test? I don't even know what their testing capabilities are, because that's, as we're finding that too, just at the hospital, is, we're restricted in the amount of tests that we have. I think the state of Iowa has only done several thousand right now, and they are only set up staffing wise to test a certain amount of people. So looking at some of these other third world countries, and you see some of these countries that have 0 cases in Africa, and you just kind of wonder, is that because it's not there, or is it because they're not testing for it? I remember, again, this is constantly in flux and changing. Our testing parameters at the hospital, we were kind of talking about this before. I think some of the people's frustration, because we would have people come in and say, hey, I'm sick and I want to be tested. And we were like, well, we'd love to test you, but we were kind of restricted. We're, going by what our company that we use to test, they would have certain criteria for us to use, where you couldn't test people unless they had been to a high risk area for a while, and if they had symptoms. And so now that's constantly changing too. They came out with altered testing parameters where it was more kind of based off of symptoms and a risk for being around other people. And so I'm sure by the time I go back to work next time, it'll probably have changed too. Now there are other companies too, across the street, there's a clinic in town, and they didn't have any restrictions. They could test whoever they wanted because they used a different vendor.
Okay. So there is a coronavirus test that multiple companies have developed. And depending on that company, creates the qualifications of who may or may not be allowed to be tested.
Yes.
That's
That's where
very
there's
informative
discrepancy
because,
too. Because
yeah, I've heard, we want as many people to test as possible so we can kind of, and then you've heard stories, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's like, they've just kind of quit doing tests in one place, and
or like, how did this NBA player get tested? That when it's restricted. Well, I mean, there's different companies that do different tests, and so everybody's getting mad at these, government people because like, why are they testing NBA players? And it's like, well, it's kind of, I mean, it's obviously
it's
different.
more subjective. It's not, because it almost seems like, well, those people who have connections get, but it's more delineated towards agencies of who are producing the
and
tests.
even the clinic that could do it on anybody, they were kind of being selective of who they were doing that because they don't want to overwhelm their testing agency either. So, and I think obviously they're working on faster tests. I mean, it will be ideal when we get to the point, and I think it'll really help with treatment once we get to the point where we can do like a bedside test where it's like a pregnancy test where you test it and you have an answer really quickly.
Yeah.
Right now, the other problem is it takes several days to get the test back. So we're kind of, even the numbers that we're seeing today are several days old.
Actually from maybe a few days ago. So it's technically Tuesday. You're probably watching this Thursday evening. Should someone be watching this feel as if they've got one of the three symptoms or like, oh, wait a minute, I can't smell anything anymore. What do you do to kind of maybe lower anxiety or point towards here's your next step if someone's feeling like they have symptoms?
Sure. So, I think there's a number of approaches that you could take. So the recommendation from the, CDC would be if you have mild symptoms, don't
isolate.
Stay away. You don't need to be tested. You don't need to be treated. If you have mild symptoms, just keep yourself at home and stay away from other people, especially people that would be at risk for severe illness. And so if you're sick, stay home. If you're curious about testing, what I would recommend is just call your doctor's office, or there is a phone number too that people can call to get more information, 211. So if you dial 211, you can get information from people as far as, should I stay home? Should I come in and get tested? Really, I think a lot of what, we're encouraging people, if you start to develop more severe symptoms, then you probably will need to come in to be evaluated. So if you're feeling short of breath or you think you might be low on oxygen,
that tips the scale pretty quick. Go
right now,
attention.
the treatment is supportive care right now because we don't have specific, medications against it.
So being in the hospital is not necessarily making you better. It's more coping with the reality of where you are.
Sure. Unless somebody's, dehydrated or needs oxygen supplementation or needs a ventilator, there's really not much benefit to being in the hospital. And going to the hospital when you have mild symptoms, you're just going to potentially put yourself at risk to be exposed to somebody else that has it if you don't. So
that's interesting. Well, hey, I appreciate you just spending a little bit of time with me and having this conversation with everyone. It's interesting, and I just learned a ton right there. And so thank you so much for
thanks for having me.
All right. And that will conclude this episode of our conversation.